One that April with his shore sote, the drocht of March hath pierced the rote, and bathed every vein in sweet liquor, of which thereto engendered is the floor. When Zephyrus eke with his sweete breath inspired hath in every holt and heath, the tender crocus and the younge sun hath in their arm his half course y run, and smalle fowles maken melodie, that slepen all the nicht with open ye. So pricketh him natuur in her courages, then longen folk to goon on pilgrimages, and palmers for to seken stronger strondes, to fern halfways couth in sundry landes, and specially from every sheeres end of Engelon to Canterbury they wend, the holy blissful martyr for to sake, that him hath holpen one that they were sake.
Hello, welcome to Chaucer. I hope you already listened to my introduction video. This video is not about the introduction. It is more about actual information pertaining to this week's lesson. Anyway, some of the ideas that I want you to cover this week are, one, some of the introduction to language. You'll find links to, for instance, the difference between Old English and Middle English. You'll find another document that will help you with pronouncing Middle English. You'll also find information on the medieval estates, and you will also find a biography of Chaucer's life and links to other information about his life and works. I would really like it if you would cover some of that information this week. We can say that Chaucer did live primarily in the 14th century, and his works were done during that period. He was very popular at court. He was a courtier, served as a diplomat, went to France for a time. This is probably why, for many people, Chaucer is considered almost Renaissance-like in his works, in a sense that one of the things that many people claim as the difference between Renaissance works and those of the Middle Ages are the sources that they're quoting. And the Middle Ages like to quote sources. They like to quote lots of things. In fact, they rely much on what they call authority or authorite, which basically means, if it was from Rome, classical Rome especially, that it was more valuable than anything else at the time, because Rome was considered such an advanced society by the Middle Ages. And that continued on into the Renaissance, but there were also a number of works from Greek philosophers, especially Aristotle, that were highly popular. And the whole move in the Renaissance was, it's called humanism, was resulted from, I should say, I guess, more of those texts, especially from ancient Greece, that were preserved in Arabic text, being translated and becoming available to Europe. And the fact is, the Renaissance is not considered to really start in England until the 16th century, but it begins in Italy in the 14th century. And as we just said, Chaucer was writing in the 14th century. And since he traveled to Europe, he was exposed to more of these Renaissance ideas earlier than many of the other people in his country. And so these influenced his works, and so as you read along, you'll see that he's actually very, very well read for his time, very well educated. He's called the father of English poetry, and these are all reasons why. And he really is a masterful poet. I mean, he just writes splendidly. During that time, you weren't actually considered literate unless you could read Latin. But with Chaucer and other poets like him, what were called the vulgar tongues, which basically means any language other than Latin, started to become more and more popular, and people began to communicate more and more in those languages, especially for purposes of higher literature and even instructional text and religious texts and those sorts of things, more and more after works like Chaucer's appeared, because they were so good and they were in a vulgar tongue and not Latin, and yet they were just as valuable in their way. And so the vulgar tongue more and more began to be considered as valuable for art and learning and that sort of thing, whereas Latin before was really the only language of state. French occasionally, but mainly Latin. Latin was the language that was stressed at the time. But again, Chaucer with Middle English kind of just brought the language to a whole new level, and that began to change things and the way things were written, the way things were read. And so it's really important to understand that again. One of the things I said in our introduction email is that I wanted us to focus on Middle English this semester. And I do want you to look very closely at the language. You'll find, again, that link on pronouncing Middle English. I've included two. One that's a little easier to understand, one that's a little more involved. If you've had a linguistics course, it will be easier to understand. But it's very detailed. Anyway, and so please pay attention to those things. Like I said, though, the kind of the two golden rules to Middle English, if you're pronouncing it anyway, is the vowels sound like Spanish vowels, a, e, o, u, and you pronounce all the consonants. Therefore, if you've ever seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and they're making fun of them and they're saying, "You English kniggets," they're actually making fun of Middle English, because you would say knicht in Middle English. You would say the G and the H, which you often probably see written, and you wonder why we spelled it that way. Well, we spelled it that way because at one time we said it that way, and that's just changed over time. But at one time we did say those letters, including the word nicht, night, light was licht. And so you'll have seen a large part of change in those sorts of words. So why do we still spell them that way? And you may have wondered that. Well, it's because the advent of printing. Printing itself, I believe it's 1472, Caxton comes in with the printing press to England. Well, when he came in with printing kind of froze spelling, because before that, language was all over the place. It was not regular at all. And it just changed, and it changed to reflect the way people talked. But with printing, it became inconvenient to constantly have to change the basic way something was spelled to reflect the way people talk, because not everyone would recognize it. And so actually printing itself, just the advent of printing, was what began to give us things like punctuation and regular spelling. And so that really started the movement that way. As far in regards to English anyway. There were other more grammar laws in regards to Latin, and some of our own grammar laws have also come out of those laws of Latin grammar. But another thing that kind of pushed us towards standardization was printing in the printing press. But in Chaucer's day, it wasn't so regular. Things varied a great deal. But I still think you'll be able to recognize a lot of the language. Anyway, and you need to recognize that things were very, very different at that time, and yet they were very, very similar to our own time. Basic human impulses haven't changed much. From the first time we were walking on the planet, humans still have basic needs, and humans still react in basic ways. And I think you'll find that very similar as we read along, is that in the Middle Ages they had the same appetites, they were concerned with many of the same problems, had some of the same problems with prejudice and things like that we do today. At the same time that they were very alien, they didn't have the conveniences that we do. And I really can't overstate that, obviously, but they really didn't. Those conveniences make our lives so much easier. And, if you think about, even just for this class, all of the tasks that you accomplish with a computer in the sense of typing, well, that had to all be handwritten out. And so the way things were administrated and all was very different, much slower, had to work much slower because of having to be hand done instead of having a machine that could do it for you. Trying to think. And so those are all things that are important. Now, they had social class just like we do, but their social classes were not quite as fluid as ours are. In America today, you can move from one social class to another based on how much money you earn. Now, to some degree, you can be born into a social class, because if your parents are rich and you're born into a rich background, then you will have those advantages, unless that income is lost for some reason. You will have those advantages, and you'll have more advantages to start off with, and so you may be able to better your situation, from being upper class to being really upper class. But just because you're born into a less advantaged situation or a poor situation here in America doesn't mean you can't work your way up into a middle class or even an upper class situation if you so desire. That was not as much the case during Chaucer's time. There were 3 estates that you'll read about this week, and one of those is the church. Another of those was the common people, peasants, that sort. And then, of course, the other is the aristocracy, which would also include royalty. And then there's a 4th estate that is not mentioned so much in that information, but that includes the bourgeoisie. During the Middle Ages is really when you begin to see the middle class. And when we say middle class, we mean people like merchants and guilds, people with trades. And these people mainly lived in cities and towns. Chaucer, in fact, comes from this class. He is not from the other 3 classes, though technically he would probably be grouped in with the peasant class or the common class instead of the bourgeoisie. But really the bourgeoisie begins in this period, and he's from that class. And in fact, the bourgeoisie were kind of the exception to the rule. Their positions were much more fluid, because he's coming out of, I guess, pedigree-wise, not that rich a family, and yet he attains quite a high status in the court of King Edward. And he can do that because he's in town. His father really was fairly well off, managed to pay for him to get some education. He began to serve in the court, and this did allow him to gain some status in the court. And of course, being literary at the time would also be another way to gain status in the court. So these are all kind of key important ideas about Chaucer and his life and things that are going on in the time. We're just kind of going for an overview right now. I would love it if you guys would ask some questions as we go through all of this. Anyway, one of the things I did also want to talk about a little bit, and we've talked about it briefly just in the sense that I did have to write everything down, is manuscript culture. Obviously the Canterbury Tales that we're about to read were written in a manuscript. So it was all written down by hand and decorated beautifully, at least in the Ellesmere version. Not all manuscripts were decorated. Some were just plain, but many of them were. And some of them, the decoration was just for decoration purposes. And for others, it was actually practical in the sense that they separated certain parts of the texts in the ways we do chapters and such today, with chapter headings and all that sort of thing. And they did that as well. I actually have 2 examples. They're not real medieval books, but they are what are called facsimile copies. But they are actually approximate to the text in the Middle Ages. Let's see, I have here what's called a Book of Hours that I'm going to show you. This is a very small book. It's about 2 by 3 inches. And a Book of Hours was a religious book. It had the Psalms in it. If any of you are Catholic, you might realize or recognize the phrase like observing the hours by saying certain psalms. Anyway, this is 2 by 3 inches, and I want you to notice the decoration. It's just really exquisite. The detail, and you can't even see because my video camera cannot possibly capture the detail that is found in these manuscripts. You can blow what is basically a 1.5 by 1 inch miniature in these books up to 3 by 3 feet, and every detail's perfect. I mean, it's just astounding. And they didn't have glasses like some of us do, and I'm sure that many of the people who did it still had good eyesight, but the fact that they were able to accomplish that in such small proportions, that kind of decoration has always been amazing to me. They really believed in order. and they believed in everything having its place, and that's kind of reflected in their art. And let me get this other text. Ugh. Okay, you hear the noise. Okay, this one is a facsimile copy of Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, which is another text, but it's from the 15th century. Anyway, this is it, and as you can see, it's larger than my head, in fact. It's really big. Anyway, and this is what it looks like inside. And it's, so the difference in sizes between one type of medieval book and the other is pretty extreme. Books of hours were actually meant to be carried in your pocket when you traveled, and many of them were carried by the nobility, and they were often beautiful. The book I just showed you, which is rather large, well, many books were that size as well, including books for the church. They had hymnals, just like we do, and they had to be large because books were expensive to produce, and so many people would have to read out of one book, for instance, a church choir, and so it had to be large enough that the entire choir could read it. And they would be even larger than that book I just showed you, which probably weighs a good 10 pounds. So they made them as large as they need to be for the practical purpose for which they were designed. And I think that's really important also to understand. Do we have books of varying sizes today? Yes, we have many books. But many of our sizes are standardized, again, because of the printing press. The printing press really changed a lot of things. And again, introduced a lot more standardization. And in fact, technology, any advent of technology does, in fact, tend to make us want to standardize. It doesn't always make it immediately standard or perfectly standard, but it tends to make us want to standardize. Another key thing to know, though, about the Middle Ages is they didn't have the idea of intellectual property that we have now. Now we currently have ideas like copyright, and you own something, so you need to cite your sources. In fact, you've probably heard many of your teachers say how important it is to cite your sources. In the Middle Ages, the concept of plagiarism didn't really exist in the way that it exists for us. They pretty much just borrowed wholesale, and they would reshape it in the way that was appropriate, maybe to their country or their culture, keeping the main storylines often similar. So what you're going to find in these texts that we're studying this semester is that pretty much all of them came from somewhere else. Chaucer, in fact, is not so much original then in coming up with stories, and that may be strange to us when originality, especially in novels and such, is something that we prize. It wasn't something that the Middle Ages prized. Originality wasn't their thing. Taking something that had been done before and doing it better than the last guy did it was something that was prized. And that's exactly what Chaucer did. It is his language and the ways he reshaped his stories that make him original. And there's quite a bit of originality in that by itself, but I think we need to see, or maybe rethink our own cultural values about what is valuable in a story. And if we put ourselves in a medieval mindset for a second, and we think that maybe redoing something and redoing it better is actually valuable, and is in its way original, I think we're going to understand where Chaucer and his audience are coming from a lot better. And I think we're going to value these texts a lot better as well. And so I encourage you to do that as you read these stories. So we've talked about a lot of different things. We've talked about the estates, where Chaucer's coming from, mainly a middle class. We're talking about how he's well traveled, better read than most of the people in his country because of his travels. We've talked about books and how books and their sizes and their decoration would depend on who bought it, mainly the aristocracy, and if the richer the person, the more beautiful it would be, quite frankly. And, we've talked about how their sizes are often for practical purposes in the sense of something like a hymnal or a larger book meant to be read aloud to a group of people, like the Mallory text. those are also larger. And we've also talked about the idea of originality. There are going to be a lot of other things we cover this semester, but this is probably enough for now. And so just email me or post any questions that you have. I know I've been fairly general. I think a lot of the specifics are in the materials that I've provided. But I'm really trying to give you a general overview. There's just so much to know, and I couldn't possibly give all of it to you. You just need a general understanding so the texts make more sense to you, or don't seem so alien as to seem, I don't know, that maybe you're intimidated by them or something, because you shouldn't be. Like I said, people are people, whatever age, and if you just understand some of the basic differences in cultures, you will also better understand these texts. And so I'm going to sign off now and wish you a good day, evening, whatever time you're watching this, and I hope to hear from you soon.